We're here at the middle of our phase on the cosmos, Science Presentation 6, and we're continuing to tune our sense of the cosmos by pairs of persons who have made an extraordinary difference in our lifetimes to the way in which the cosmos is real. The first pair were Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr, the founder of the theory of relativity and the founder of the theory of quantum mechanics. The second pair are two women, Vera Cooper Rubin, and Barbara McClintock. They are of the very, very large and the very, very small. Vera Rubin is the discoverer of dark matter in the universe, and the book that we're using by her is a collection of her papers, Bright Galaxies and Dark Matters. Bright Galaxies, Dark Matters. And she is at the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism at the Carnegie Institution of Washington in Washington, D.C. But she came out of a generation where women were not encouraged to go into science at all, especially astronomy. But Barbara McClintock comes from a generation before her, and it was almost unheard of for women to be allowed into science, and both of them experienced the severe constraints of irrationality in regards to the study of science and the study of the cosmos. By not having a tunability of human sensitivity, science was severely, except for very rare geniuses. And very quickly, the work of very rare geniuses was mulched into and folded back into a masculine, flatted out perspective that eventually lodged itself in doctrine and doctrinaire outlooks upon the universe, upon human beings, and upon the whole process by which control and authority is portioned out by a mentality which bases itself on the control of what people do, of what things are supposed to be and how they interact, so that the whole ritual basis of existence was commandeered by a mental authoritarian tyranny, and in between them, human experience was constantly being shoved together until one could make nice little snowballs out of experience, and out of this one could then say, this is what man looks like when you stack these snowballs, and you got a fake snowman instead of a human being. Now, when Barbara McClintock was born in 1902, was right at the cusp where, for the first time, the science of genetics got traction. And it's extraordinary because the science of genetics had had its genius almost a half a century before. His name was Gregory Mendel, and he was from what is today the Czech Republic. And the Czech Republic was an extraordinary place in history, especially because one of the greatest innovators in planetary education came from the Czech Republic came from, in fact, the Moravian section of the Czech Republic that Gregory Mendel came from as well. His name was John Amos Comenius, and his educational program in the early 1600s, he was born about 1571, his educational program by the 1630s was the most revolutionary education program in planetary history since the heydays of Plato and Pythagoras. He is the one who made it very clear that we must educate boys and girls together, that all children must be educated together. And pursuant to this, Comenius made the world's first pictorial textbook for boys and girls to learn. It was called the Orbis Pictus, and it started off with very basic things. This is a hand, these are fingers, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10. By tens, one can begin to count. Very, very, very simple. The technique of Comenius was revivified 300 years later in the early 1930s by two great geniuses that we looked at in our education previously in the symbols section, I.A. Richards and his friend C.K. Ogden, who developed in England, because England by 1930 was still the empire that spanned the world, and English as a language was becoming, instead of French, the lingua franca of the world. And to teach English to all kinds of people, boys and girls of every conceivable type, world round, they devised Basic English. And the picture book that went with Basic English is a harmonic resonance of Comenius's first Orbis Pictus. And we showed that, and you can review the DVDs from the symbols lectures on that. And eventually, a very simple vocabulary of English was teachable so that someone could learn the language from scratch, whatever age, wherever you were, but especially easily when you were a child, so that English was alongside of whatever languages you used in your hometown, in your home country. And so it would become the auxiliary language of the world, and has since become so. In that section of what is today the Czech Republic, they were always in between power groups like the German power groups, the Russian power groups, the Italian power groups, the Eastern Slav power groups. And so that whole quality of temperament of those people, one part of the Czech Republic it's called Bohemia, out of which we get Bohemians. And the Bohemian lifestyle is free and easy. The Moravians are free and easy with a spiritual maturity that is calm and takes its maturation in a natural, easy way, rising into the blossom of consciousness. Whereas the Bohemians have the vivacity of the dynamic of life, and all the maturation is nourished from the continuing development of the freedom of that dynamic. So that the two kinds of energy are exemplified there in the historic Czech Republic. the Bohemian emphasis on the freedom of the dynamic, and the Moravian emphasis on the blossoming of the energy forms. Gregory Mendel, the founder of genetics, published his first book on the principles of hybridization in 1866, and it was almost unattended by anyone until the early 1900s. And so Barbara McClintock was born right at the time where it was beginning to be an area of interest, and as she grew up as a youngster, both loving the dynamic of being with people and being with animals and being with the plants, but at the same time having an inner sense, as we talked about last week in the presentation. She discovered an inner quietness of her own, which was extraordinary. Her home life was often contentious, with a mother that was insisting that she be a girl and do girl things so she could get married in the right way. And Barbara did not want to do that. She wanted to explore both the dynamic, and then when she discovered her inner calm, she wanted to explore how that fits in to the world. And used to, as a girl, run on the beaches of Long Island out near the tip of it, and in running in her own way, she discovered that if she held her posture in a yogic, very straight way, that she could run extremely fast without having to bend over, without having to get into a bipedal kind of elope, that she could literally glide. And it wasn't until later in life that she discovered that there is a Tibetan Vajrayana yoga for running in this way, and that lamas practiced it all through the developments that came out of Milarepa in the Kargyupa tradition and into Tsongkhapa later on. That one can run in this way almost indefinitely because you do not use energy. You flow in a universal dynamic. You have your physicality in eternity and not in the world of polarity. And Barbara McClintock discovered this, and one of the quiet things that she was able to do, here's a children's book, Barbara McClintock Alone in Her Field. She raised corn. She spent 50 years raising a special kind of corn, American Indian corn, called maize. And she is the one who discovered that genes jump around. They do not stay put where they're supposed to be, and that they can move within the chromosome and carry different creative DNA strands to places they were not there before and perhaps never were, and that they can jump, in fact, between chromosomes. She discovered that life has a true freedom in its dynamic, and her collected works here is called The Dynamic Genome. And in The Dynamic Genome, published by the Cold Spring Harbor Press, and Cold Spring Harbor is in a section of Long Island on Long Island Sound. It is up until a week ago, the emeritus director of it was James D. Watson, the discoverer of the structure of the double helix of DNA back in 1953. He made a comment before an English tour about racial capacities, and it was overblown, and he had to cancel his European book tour of his new book that has come out. He's now 80 years old. It's interesting because Cold Spring Harbor as a laboratory was originally founded and was a part of the Carnegie Institution. And here in this history of the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, Houses of Science by Mrs. James D. Watson, by Elizabeth Watson. And it's interesting because the Carnegie Institution, when it gave over to the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, that our other woman that we're taking, Vera C. Rubin, is at the Carnegie Institution in Washington, D.C., and has been there in the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism now for almost 40 years. The patience of a woman, whether it is in 50 years of watching how corn grows in the ever-increasing analytic down to the genes, or watching the movement of stars that accrue into galaxies, and that galaxies accrue into clusters, and that clusters of galaxies accrue into superclusters, that sometimes there are spaces in the universe where there are no galaxies, there are no stars, and those voids, the largest one found so far, is 400 million light years across. That the cosmos is large enough to have a little incidental space like this. And yet, it was someone like Vera Rubin who patiently worked on the edges, on the fringes, on the margins, like Barbara McClintock with the very, very small. She worked with the very, very, very large. And one finds in her Century of Galaxy Spectroscopy, collected here in Bright Galaxies, Dark Matters, she writes, 100 years ago, no one knew what a galaxy was. This was in 1995. But 96 years ago, Shiner reported the first successful spectrum of a galaxy in a 2-page paper in Volume 9 of the Astrophysical Journal on the spectrum of the Great Nebula in Andromeda. Andromeda is one of the few galactic structures that the human eye can see. It is about 2.2 million light years away, but is as large as the Milky Way galaxy, and so is quite a bright blur to many people, but visible as a nebula, as a cloud to sharp-eyed people. Edwin Hubble's great 1930s book was called In the Realm of the Nebula. One of the earliest excursions out into galactic terrain, and one of the first great astronomers, along with Hubble, to recognize that it is the galactic structures that are the scalar by which the universe can be understood. And that other fellow was named Harlow Shapley, who was the director of the Harvard Observatory, and whose works we looked at last week, some of them early, like Star Clusters, publication number 2 of the Harvard Observatory in 1930, and his first textbook on galaxies, 1943, which was a breakthrough. But his earliest work was a series of addresses on radio on astronomy to the population at large to alert them that something huge was happening and that they have every right to know, because Shapley was very much a humanist in the ancient democratic tradition. Everyone has a right to know. This is their universe as well. That collection of radio addresses was published in 1926 and included 2 women astronomers live on the radio. One of the women who benefited from Harlow Shapley was his daughter Mildred Shapley Matthews, and she was born in 1915. And she is one of the great figures of women in planetary astronomy. And she's the editor of at least 13 or 15 big, huge volumes on modern astronomy of the cosmos, published by the University of Arizona Press in Tucson. Her Mars book, published in 1992, is about 1,500 pages. She's the editor of that. She's still, as far as I can determine, alive and working into her 90s. Barbara McClintock lived to be 90. These are long-lived women whose patience is not only to see down to the very, very small and up to the very, very large, but that it has a reflexive, conscious quality that steps up the order of insight. And that science is not a ritual practice. It is a prismatic array of insight that is arrayed through the prism of the person. Without the prismatic person, there is no science. What you get is a regression back to a mental dogma, a symbolic order that you assume is right, procedures that you assume have been ironed out for centuries and for millennia, and all men agree to this, and so it must be so. And all of this is not only suspect but phony. It is an illusion, and it is a delusion. The most beautiful way in which this was brought into question was brought into question by Niels Bohr, who we paired with Einstein, and we took a look at the way in which Bohr found that causality got in the way of actuality in terms of both theory and experiment by the late 1920s, and by early 1930, it was apparent that this was the case. One of the qualities that came out of this for Bohr was the insistence that there be such a thing as an open world, and not only an open world, but an open mind. That human beings with an open mind in an open world are available for the insight, for the visionary consciousness that is necessary for a prismatic person, and it is the community of prismatic persons who really generate history. And without a historical sense of kaleidoscopic possibility, you cannot have the forms of science. Science comes out of the kaleidoscopic, prismatic possibilities. And instead of having a universe determined by mentality, you have a cosmos that is infinite in its own right. It is the scientific appreciation of the harmonic of the infinite cosmos that gives a resonance to the prism of the spiritual person, who is really free because their field of consciousness is coextensive with the field of nature. This quality of bringing two hands together, the field of nature and the field of consciousness, so that they tune, and they tune in such a way that they interplay and they interpenetrate, and like all intercourse, they have an exchange of centers. The center that exchanges from the field of nature that has matured itself to the integral of the mind, its center that exchanges is the imagination based on imagery of experience, based on traction in existence, based on the actions that one pragmatically does. And so the imagination exchanges with the field of consciousness and becomes creative imagining, the indispensable trigger for art, for the spiritual person to come forth and emerge not integrally but differentially, and become prismatic rather than just pragmatic. But what comes out of the field of consciousness is the function of remembering, and it exchanges places with the imagination and becomes, in the symbolic order, the memory. The process of remembering becomes the memory, and now the mind that has the ability to utilize integrally a memory begins to recognize and understand the need to, yes, to have experience in a cultural way, but to also let it blossom so that experience becomes kaleidoscopic, not in a cultural way, but in a whole civilization of many possible cultures working together, becoming a tapestry. The mind left to a cultural basis will envision a universe that is unified. It will become the one place, the one right thing. But in recognition of a kaleidoscope of possibilities, a civilization is not a culture of a universe, but is a harmonic of a cosmos. Its range is infinite. While you can index integrals by a binary of 0 and 1, computers are based on this, you cannot index consciousness in its ecology by 0 and 1. Its binary is 0 and infinity. And the human capacity to deal with infinity as easily as one deals with unity is the hallmark of the prismatic person, of the spiritual person. To become free in face of infinity so that it is the creative play that is operative and not the constrained rules. And it's only by playing that the universe opens up into the cosmos. Then we have science instead of authority. One of the essays in volume 4 of the collected papers of Niels Bohr, the philosophic writings of Bohr, his collected works are 10 volumes published in Copenhagen. But 4 volumes of excerpts of his philosophic writings. Volume 4, the Oxbow Press out of Connecticut, 1998. They include the 1948 little essay on the notions of causality and complementarity. This was written in 1948 at the end of World War II because Bohr had become involved by this time for more than 10 years with the struggle to alert the world that a sea change had happened in human beings. that like a genie that has been released from its bottle, you cannot stuff it back in. And the genie was that man had developed the capacity to have atomic power and also had developed the capacity to leave the planet. In early 1949, at White Sands, New Mexico, a two-stage WAC Corporal rocket went 250 miles into space. That's farther than the International Space Station orbits. Its orbit is under 220 miles. That program was called the MX program. And one could have put a satellite into orbit by 1949. The reason why it was not is that a causal, mental, authoritarian, tyrannical mentality stopped it, canceled the program. You boys can play with captured V2 rockets and experiment, but you may not develop the capacity to go into Earth orbit. And the decision was made by 12 men headed by the American Secretary of Defense, James S. Forrestal. And the reason for it is that Forrestal was a number with 11 others of the majestic 12 who took over, who commandeered the crashed UFOs from the Roswell incident. And if you take a look at the movie Roswell with Kyle MacLachlan and Martin Sheen, you'll see a very accurate portrayal that Forrestal was the first one who got scared because of the telepathy of a dying alien. And within a year of canceling the MX program so that human beings could not go into this new world of space because there are things out there to be afraid of, who knows what they will do, ran screaming into the streets and committed suicide, shouting, "They're here, they're here." By almost 2008, it is time to wake up to many aspects, and this learning is a time-honored wisdom tradition, graduated and scaled, so that you can free yourself permanently on any scale from one to the planet and beyond. To consider Earth as an Earth is naive. It is a planet among trillions. It has a nice name, Terra. We're terrestrials, not Earthlings. And it isn't a globe. The global village, the global economy, is an authoritarian term for control. It's a planet, and so the correct term is planetary. And there is such a thing as a planetary culture. Of all the cultures that are able in the tapestry of the planet to add to its blossoming, to its bouquet, whereas the civilization larger than the planetary culture is the star system. And that stellar civilization is exactly what is being developed now. And this is an education like John Amos Comenius, 400 years ago almost, to deliver a population of people who will be able to improve it indefinitely. And generations of children raised with this kind of freedom will be able to inhabit not only the star system, but explore the interstellar frontier with wild elegance and with spiritual freedom. If there are aliens not enjoying that, then they need to go to school as well. And they're welcome as long as they pay. Let's take a break. Let's come back, and we're trying to understand something that is actually very esoteric, and very few people have understood it, much less understood it well. This is Gregory Mendel, the founder of genetics. And this biography of him, written by Vítězslav Orel, who was at the time that this was published about 10 years ago by Oxford, he was the emeritus head of the Mendelium in Brno, Czech Republic. And the monastery there in Brno is right next to the cathedral. And on page 45 comes this very interesting material. This has to do with the way in which science actually occurs mysteriously in history. The monastery in Brno, next to the church of St. Thomas, was founded in 1350 by the Margrave of Moravia. His real name was Johann Heinrich, and he was the brother of Charles IV, who was the emperor. And Charles IV had just a couple of years before, in 1348, founded the university in Prague, one of the earliest universities in the world. The University of Paris, Oxford, Prague University, all of these coming into play. Oxford and the University of Paris in the early 1200s, and then by the middle of the 1300s, you began to have, again, institutions that called themselves universities because it was universal learning in a great grand tradition. The Margrave and his descendants were buried in the monastery, and the monks were obliged to pray for their souls. The material needs of the monastery were provided for by a number of villages allotted to it as a source of feudal income. And so very quickly, in order to support themselves, the monks of monasteries all over the world go into raising their own produce, farming, raising their own animals. And one of the specialities here was the raising of sheep, a special quality and kind of sheep whose wool was very much in demand, and also experimenting with crop rotation, one of the first places in the world that did this, and with ecology of recycling material into the land, and also of experimenting by having orchards of various fruit trees staggered in such a way that the background for Mendel's genetic experiments in the 1800s was laid 500 years before by a characteristic of this particular monastery, because they had a lot of lands, and it was famous for doing investigations of how to improve animals and plants. But one of the most secret pivots in the cathedral, and thus the monastery at Brno, is that the portrait of the Black Madonna was on the altar. And the Black Madonna is one of the most magisterial and magically wonderful icons in all of Christianity. It is purported to have been based on sketches of Luke, the apostle. And the portrait of the Black Madonna, for centuries, and now for almost a millennium, has been a talisman of healing, of miraculous energies. And the original gift of the portrait of the Black Madonna was by the high medieval emperor Frederick II, known also as Frederick Barbarossa. And Frederick II is one of the very powerful figures in world history, who was literally thrust into greatness, not only because his family was royal, but he was thrust into cosmic orders of greatness. Shakespeare in Twelfth Night has Malvolio say, "Some men are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them." Frederick II was this way. His guardian was Pope Innocent III, and he was the Prince of Palermo in Sicily. So that when he would come of age, he would be the king of Sicily. And later, Frederick II became, of course, the greatest of all of the emperors. He hearkened back to Charlemagne. He became the emperor of Germany, the emperor of all of the lands. He's the one that got the portrait of the Black Madonna sometime in the early 1200s. He was born in 1195, and by the time he was 14, it was decided, because of royal lineages and for imperial politics, that he should marry at 14, and he was married to a woman who was 10 years older than him, who was a widow already, whose husband had been the king of Hungary. She was a Spanish woman, the daughter of the king of Aragon. And so they were married in 1209, and at the time, not only was Innocent III his guardian, but his tutor was a man about 30 years older than him, whose name was Michael Scott. And Michael Scott is one of the all-time great transformation figures. He was born in Scotland, and his birthplace, we are not sure what time. I would imagine it was 1165. He was born in Balwearie Castle, and he is buried nearby at the end of his long, adventurous life, and it was adventurous. He's buried in Melrose Abbey, that's very near Balwearie Castle in Scotland. Michael Scott was the greatest magus of his age. He was an ancient Hermetic wisdom master, and he was the tutor for Frederick II. And Michael Scott was the first one to introduce alchemy, reintroduce alchemy to the Christian West, to the Latin West. They had lost track of it, and because he was a master of many things, a real magus, he's the one that brought alchemy back into the Western tradition about 1200. He also brought astrology back in, and he brought them both along with a higher mathematics. Alchemy, astronomy, and mathematics from the Arabs, and re-infused the whole Western tradition so that you had a swelling, not of the feudal medieval period, but of the beginning of a deep questing, royal, imperial, high medieval, to try to find a way to culminate man in a very, very special way, and Michael Scott was instrumental in this. And he's the one who secured for Frederick II the portrait of the Black Madonna from Arabic lands, from which it had been lost to the West for a millennia. In the biography, one of the great biographies of Michael Scott is by Lynn Thorndike, whose big 8-volume History of Experimental Science, published by Columbia University, is still one of the great standard scholarly sets of learning in the world. He writes in here, Michael believed further that demons could not endure the sound of harmony and fled from music, whether vocal or instrumental, or from the songs of birds. He thought that the 9th sphere was silent as well as starless, but that the 8th sphere of the fixed stars revolved melodiously with smoothest sound and sweetest voice, because outside itself it had an essence, the 9th sphere, by which this sound was reflected. This is a Hermetic insight of dark matter and dark energy. And also, in the Renaissance, in the High Renaissance, the High Medieval had a High Renaissance right next to it. And the way that you can tell the difference of the figures is that the High Medieval era culminated in Dante, and the High Renaissance era began with Chaucer. They're very close, they're extremely different. Dante writes of the Inferno, the Purgatorio in between, and the Paradiso. Chaucer writes about human beings in their full array. Dante is the high medieval poet of a symbolic order that can be interpreted in 4 different ways, anagogical and so forth, allegorical. Whereas Chaucer said of his own writings, I write of a fair field full of folk. The array of human nature had infinite possibilities, but that there were character types that one could follow, and indeed, not only character types, but there are periodicities. And the periodicities come from Michael Scott, bringing them back. Here is Thorndike. Now, not only are there passages in Scott's writings which seem reminiscent of his own student days, but there are other features which suggest he may have taught grammar, that is, the Latin language and literature, before going to Toledo, Spain, as a translator, or making astrology his specialty. For example, having stated that the zodiac is divided into 360 degrees, the 12 signs of the zodiac, that the whole circle of the ecliptic is 360 degrees, and that 36 days of the solar year make a 10th part of it. He adds that the heaven as a whole barely makes one revolution in 36,000 years, so that it takes 3,000 years to move the length of a single sign of the zodiac. This is 800 years ago. 9,000 years to cover 1/4 of the celestial circle, or 1 triplicity of the signs, and 18,000 years to complete 1/2 of that circle. So that for the very first time in the West, for maybe 600 years, maybe 700 years, You had someone capable and competent to be able to understand that a mathematic is not divinatory on a mythic level. That's called mathesis. But mathesis is the ability to calculate on the basis of an analytic and to understand that you can prove it out by experiment and investigation, by a scientific outlook. And Michael Scott is one of the founders of the rebirth of science in the West. His influence was so pervasive that two of his influenced descendants in England were Robert Grosseteste and Roger Bacon. Robert Grosseteste, the Bishop of Lincolnshire in England, was also the great professor at Oxford, and his prize student was Roger Bacon. And between them, they brought science back into play at Oxford, where it had been lacking. England had not had science since the last years of the 5th century, the 400s. Because Frederick II Barbarossa was tutored for years by Michael Scott. And a lot of his emphasis was to make sure that there were places of learning that were protected. The monastery at Brno, which was originally the Queen's monastery, meaning the Queen, the wife of Frederick II, it had this tradition for centuries that someone really special in the field of learning should be not only protected, but given free rein without overseeing. And in order to ensure this, the monastery of Brno was directly responsible to the to the Director General of the Augustinian Order in Rome, or his delegate. So that there was no middle man, there was no middle authoritarian ladder, there was just simply the guarantee that learning should be protected and men of learning should be nourished at whatever they're doing, and Gregory Mendel took advantage of this. By the way, the beautiful thing about the 8th sphere of the fixed stars and the 9th sphere being silent, you find that in the High Renaissance in the Tarot deck of Mantegna, which we have looked at before. The 48th card in that 50-card deck, because it's Pythagorean, it is not Rosicrucian, it is not occult. The Pythagorean Hermetic tradition is scientific, not metaphysical. There's a world of difference. The 48th card is the sphere of the fixed stars, and the 49th card is the sphere of the open, infinite, silent superspace through which the stars can move. It's like we know now, and the 50th card, of course, was the undiscovered country of the real cosmos. The universe has, in one way, the fixed stars, but they have their movement. Notice the Hermetic tradition, even when it comes back 800 years ago, that there's a movement through the zodiac. There is not only a movement through the zodiac, that is the scalar of the movement of the sphere of the heavens, and that the movement of the sphere of the heavens, each star has its own resonance, And it is the harmonic of all the stars' resonance together that gives the harmony of the cosmos. And if one only knew the movement of the whole, one could hear the symphony of the universe, and from there have a direct intuition of the open infinity of God's realm, within which field the universe has its movement indexed by its music. And that while demons flee music, hell shrinks to oblivion in the face of the universal harmony heard by man. And so the purpose was to hear the music of the cosmos. It wasn't until the late 20th century that science was developed enough in the new Hermetica to be able to compute mathematically not just the movement of stars, or even the movement of all the stars, some 2 trillion of the galaxy, but the movement of galaxies in their clusters, in their superclusters, in their cosmic spread. And Vera C Rubin was instrumental in that. And her first excursions into astronomy were at Cornell University, where Barbara McClintock had also studied. They were both initially educated at Cornell. They were both eventually sheltered and protected by the Carnegie Institution, because Andrew Carnegie from Scotland understood the old Michael Scott tradition that learning should be not only respected but protected and given freedom to mature itself, and that the freedom is not based on a mental authority, but is based on the prismatic exploration of the spiritual person free to do so. This is a totally different outlook. The previous outlook is a feudal, medieval outlook, however high. The other is a Renaissance looking out, and not an outlook at all, but a looking out not only to see what one could see, but to allow the seer to see the seer in whatever new ways there are going to be. Our educational, inculcated systems around the globe are medieval. They are feudal. They are full of authoritarian illusion, and they are full of demonic delusion, and they flee and shy away from anything that brings the music of spiritual harmonics back into play on a planetary scale. It is not only the challenge of the open world, exemplified by Niels Bohr beautifully, but the open world brought into play here in the beautiful Terry lectures at Yale University, The Open World, 3 lectures on the metaphysical implications of science by the great Hermann Weyl, who is the founder of set theory and a number of mathematical developments. He writes in here, God and the universe, it was natural for man to attribute the cause for the lawfulness of the world to the reign of souls endowed with reason. I may remind you of the words of Plato quoted at the beginning of this lecture. Kepler finds it hard to understand the obedience of the planets to his second law, which sets the velocity of the planet in functional dependence on its distance from the sun, except by assuming a planetary soul, which receives within itself the image of the sun in its changing magnitude. Much more tenaciously than such a psychical interpretation has a mechanical and machinistical interpretation of the laws of nature tried to assert and maintain itself in physics. which it could not do, because someone like a Kepler, and eventually even esoterically Newton, and then incredibly energized by Einstein and by Niels Bohr, and the gates of wonder were thrown open in the 1920s and in the 1930s. And part of the demonic recoil from that was the emphasis to try and co-opt and commandeer this scientific breakthrough for authoritarian power. And the Second World War and the ensuing Cold War and the ensuing War on Terror are all an extension of this trying to commandeer the powers that have been developed for authoritarian structures. They kill you for speaking like this. Often, their assassination is by non-acknowledgement. Nevertheless, reality occurs real, and the spirit is free. And learning like this again is accomplished. One of the most peculiar qualities is that when Mendel was doing his experiments with sweet peas in a little garden plot that wasn't large enough to interfere with the income farms, but he became interested in following exactly how sweet peas, an innocuous crop of red and white, could be brought together, and that after a while one began to notice certain ratios, and of course the grand hermetic ratio that was his favorite was 3-to-1. Yeah. Unity and its three orders do not fold into an integral, but they make a ratio, a proportion, which then generates resonant sets that have a harmonic that is extendable indefinitely. It isn't 3 in 1 like the oil to make doors less squeaky. It's the 3-to-1 ratioability, proportionality. And the old Hermetic saying is this, and Carl Jung used to quote it a number of times in his older age. The wisdom tradition is to give you 3 corners, and it's up to you to find the 4th corner. And when you find the 4th quarter, you realize that that angle of vision is original with you. That it is you in your consciousness that now not only have completed the square of attention, the frame of reference, but because it is you who have done this originally, you are able to expand your angle of vision indefinitely, and therefore the frame of reference tilts and becomes a diamond of insight, because you are refinable indefinitely. This is a Renaissance outlook. This is a Hermetic outlook, not a metaphysical or medieval looking just to look in. Here is Niels Bohr, 1948, on the notions of causality and complementarity. The causal mode of description has deep roots in the conscious endeavors to utilize experience for the practical adjustment to our environments, and is in this way inherently incorporated in common language. Finally, the whole issue will be, you must have a poetic language in order to speak real about zero and infinity. If not, you are constrained by the rhetoric that has been approved for you to use. One of the greatest rhetorical constraints was the idea that causality is self-evident. And it's stupid to think that it's not the case. It is not the case. Ever. By the guidance which analysis in terms of cause and effect has offered in many fields of human knowledge, the principle of causality has even come to stand as the ideal for scientific explanation. And by explanation, one should read explication. This is how it is. These are the laws. These are the principles, and you must obey. Your obedience is your only choice for rationality. But ratioing is a harmonic and not a code of laws. DNA, in its double helix, is an interpenetrative, multidimensional field, not only of nature and existence, but of consciousness and person. And just like the integral of the field of nature and existence and existential actions will generate experience, the field of consciousness and the prismatic person will generate history. And history is radically differential, different from the highly integrable mythic horizon. A mythic language will always have a plot line of beginning, middle, and end. A historical development is a kaleidoscopic possibility of interpretations and understanding which one can refine indefinitely. The one emerges the integral mind, the other emerges the differential cosmos. But if there is a complementarity between the integral mind and the differential cosmos, that complementarity will be real, and the mind will open to freedom, and the cosmos will accept suggestions of conscious purpose. And in this way, they work together. And those vectors together, in recognizably, mathematically proportionate ways, actually occur. Bohr, 1948. In physics, causal description, originally adapted to the problems of mechanics, rests on the assumption that the knowledge of the state of a material system at a given time permits a prediction of its state at any subsequent time. However, already here the definition of state requires special consideration, and it need hardly be recalled that an adequate analysis of mechanical phenomena was only possible after the recognition that in the account of a state of a system of bodies, not merely their location at a given moment, but also their velocities have to be included. In classical mechanics, the forces between bodies were assumed to depend simply on the instantaneous positions and velocities, but the discovery of the retardation of electromagnetic effects made it necessary to consider force fields as an essential part of a physical system, and to include in the description of the state of a system at a given time the specification of those fields in every point of space. Yet, as is well known, the establishment of the differential equations connecting the rate of variation of electromagnetic intensities in space and time has made possible a description of electromagnetic phenomena in complete analogy to causal analysis in mechanics. And then he goes on to say that all of this seems very reasonable to the symbolic ordering structure of the mind. It is not real. It is a mirroring to the mind of its own limitations and confirms then that its order must be right because the correlations to the world and what happens in the world are exactly right according to specification, according to plan. Einstein and Bohr especially disclosed the ancient Hermetic wisdom. Nothing is planned for reality. It will be what it will be, and changes instantly into impossibilities previously, because it's creatively imagining as it goes along and is free to play. A human being who is free to play in the real will shy away from the constraints, and those constraints will try to shy away from them. One of Comenius's great books, 350 years ago, was The Labyrinth of the World and the Paradise of the Heart. In ancient India, the mantra of Ganesha was Ga, meaning heart, energy, pivot. But if it was paired, Ga, Ga, now you have a high Dharma heart harmonic that goes out indefinitely from the heart. So that the Heart Sutra in the Prajnaparamita literature has the repetition. The Sanskrit word there is a alliteration on Ga, but is pronounced Gati, which means gone. And the Heart Sutra begins Gati, Gati, Paragati, Bodhi, Svaha. Enlightenment, hail. Gone, gone, completely gone. Reality. The limitations of the mind can be put to use as an instrument, but make a terrible taskmaster. And the first shying away is that the wise heart will not be imprisoned and will do everything it can to sabotage the body and the mind to let it know that you are delusional and you are following illusion and are not real. And when the harmonic is re-musicked, the sabotage of the body and the sabotage of the mind peel away. On one level, it's health, and in the high Dharma, it's salvation. More next week.